Well, lads, hope we're doing well. Welcome to this week's episode, which is another Q&A episode. First question is, I know I need to eat plenty of fibre for my health, but with training a lot, I struggle to get enough in without bloating. Any tips? And this is a really common issue, especially for athletes who are training at high volume and high intensities. And the problem is that when fibre is consumed in large quantities, it can lead to that feeling of fullness in the stomach and digestive comfort that comes along with that. But on the other hand, we know the advantages of getting in enough fibre when it comes to our overall health. Things like supporting our digestion, gut health, our immune function, and even regulating blood sugar, for example. So the first thing I would say with this is to consider the timing of when you're consuming your higher fibre foods. So if you're having a lot of fibre in the few hours leading up to a training session, that's when you're most likely to experience this bloating and digestive comfort during that session. So what I'd recommend is trying to keep your pre-training meals relatively low in fibre, focusing more on the easily digestible carbohydrates. So things like white rice, white pasta, even things like, bread, bagels, which tend to be that bit lower in fibre, but still provide the carbohydrates that you're needing to fuel that session. Then after training and at other times of the day when you're not about to train, you can focus on getting in those higher fibre foods. So this might be the things like your whole grains, plenty of fruits and vegetables and other fibre-rich foods, beans, legumes, etc., to ensure that you're getting the benefits of high fibre intake without getting the downsides that come with it as regards to the digestive comfort issues during a training session. Another tip that I would give is to generally focus on gradually increasing your fibre intake over time rather than just jumping straight into a very high fibre diet. And this can be common in someone who wants to make a big change to their health and knows that increasing the fibre intake can have that effect on it. They might automatically try to get a large amount of fibre in within each and every meal, and therefore the body and their digestive system isn't used to processing that large amount of fibre, and it can lead to more digestive discomfort. So by gradually increasing it, you are giving your gut the time to adapt to that increased fibre load, almost training the gut in the same way you might do with carbohydrate consumption during exercise, for example. And another thing I would recommend with fibre intake and increasing that is to ensure that you're staying well hydrated throughout the day, because fibre does need water in order to move through the digestive system effectively. And if you're increasing your fibre intake but not increasing the water intake alongside it, then it can actually lead to this bloating and this digestive discomfort, or at the very least make it worse. So in summary, I would say to time your fibre intake away from training sessions, gradually increase your fibre intake over time, and also make sure you're drinking plenty of water throughout the day to support the digestive process and the increased needs for water for that fibre digestion. Question 2 is, what would you say are the biggest changes between nutrition for the off-season versus the in-season? And it's a great question, and it's something that I work through with a lot of the GAA athletes, particularly that I work with, where there is quite distinct differences between the in-season and the off-season, where in-season you're going to be having those regular matches and team training sessions where you're doing a lot of volume in a lot of cases and a lot of high intensity intermittent work, versus the off-season where you might have that little bit more flexibility with what you're training, and it can often mean that you're doing a lot of the almost opposite things that you would be in season. So for example, with your running, you might be more likely to do more zone 2 steady state work or even off feet conditioning, both of which are likely to be quite different from what you're doing in season, with a lot of high speed running, for example, in season, and twisting and turning, etc. And then on the gym work side of things, where our gym work is more orientated around performance in season, a lot of sort of plyometric work, power-based work, and doing the minimum effective dose in order to stay fresh for training session matches. Obviously in the off season, then you are more likely to use that opportunity to work more on your hypertrophy or muscle gain if that's something you need to work on. So the fact that there is that distinct difference in training and in your goals will dictate the fact that nutrition in season and off season is probably going to differ as well. The first thing we want to consider with that is the overall energy intake, and specifically the carbohydrate intake as well. How much this varies in season versus off season will depend very much on your goals. For example, whether you're trying to lose fat or gain muscle, but also on the amount of training that you're doing in the off season versus the in season. So for example, you may be Some people may be much more inactive during the off season where they don't have the constraints of team training to get them training at a high level. Whereas other people might actually be training more in the off season in order to build up more of a fitness, hypertrophy, or strength base, for example. So that will dictate that along with your goals of body weight change will dictate your energy intake and your carbohydrate intake likely changing as a result of that. So obviously that means that if you are trying to drop body fat, calorie intake is likely to be lower. And if you are training more, then calorie output, calorie intake is likely to then need to be higher in the off season. And we want to look at all of those things, and by looking at those goals of fat loss, muscle gain, increased or decreased activity, alter our overall calorie intake and adjust mostly our carbohydrate intake to allow for that. Second big difference is probably that you can have that little bit more flexibility around what you're going to be focusing on with your nutrition during the off season. Whereas in the in season, that's going to be mostly dictated by the demands of fueling for matches, recovering for next session, keeping up with training loads, etc. Whereas in the off season, we have that little bit more flexibility to focus on other goals, such as I mentioned, around body composition change, for example, which is obviously going to dictate, as we mentioned, part of your nutritional approach. Another aspect then is how much of a focus the timing of your nutrition should play. So, for example, in the in-season, the timing of your nutrition, things like your carb loading, things like your pre-match nutrition, things like your recovery, post-training, post-match, etc., become more important than those things would be in the off-season. Now, of course, in the off-season, if you want to optimize the results of your training as much as possible, then timing becomes more important. But given that we don't have those demands of having to perform at our highest within the given sport that we're prioritizing, those timing aspects of nutrition can take a little bit of a back step. But on the flip side of that, it can also be a good time to start working on those things in the off season if you haven't already done so in the in season, so that you've already ingrained those habits of fueling properly for training, looking at what might be your optimal pre-match meal and pre-match strategy for yourself, starting to optimize the recovery period after training, so that when it comes to the next in-season, you are in a good habit of looking at those things already. And therefore, when it comes to the in-season, it's just about optimizing those for the specific goals of the sport. So in summary, for the off-season versus the in-season, our nutritional may change based on whether we have a body composition goal, based on whether our training load is increasing or decreasing, and based on how much time you want to spend dedicating to the more timing-based aspects of your nutrition. Whereas the things that will stay the same will remain the fundamentals of good nutrition, things like eating enough protein, getting in plenty of fruit and vegetables, staying hydrated, eating high quality foods, and find that balance between having your nutrition in a place that is getting you towards your goals, but also being enjoyable and manageable for your lifestyle. Question number 3 is, I'm struggling with the 3 p.m. energy dip in work. How do I avoid this? The dreaded 3 p.m. energy slump is something that a lot of people will experience, and there are a few different factors that can contribute to it, and there are probably many beyond what I'm going to go into, because it is something that is a bit more general in nature. But the first thing that I would recommend considering is your lunch and what you're eating at lunchtime, because that's going to have a significant effect on your energy levels in the hours that are following it. So if you're having this very large, very heavy lunch, or a lunch that's very high in, refined carbohydrates and sugar, for example, that can lead to this high increase in blood sugar levels followed by a dip in the blood sugar levels, which can be some aspect or can form some aspect of what people experience as that energy dip mid-afternoon. And this may be something that isn't necessarily harmful, but if you are looking to optimize your energy levels in those hours, then it's something certainly worth looking at. And in terms of improving that, it's going to be sticking to the basics of having a lunch that's pretty balanced in terms of its protein, carbohydrates, and fat content, and ensuring that it's not something that is overly heavy or overly high in calories and volume in general, and even potentially looking at the type of carbohydrate source and how much sugar is involved in that, which becomes less of an issue when you have another fully balanced meal in terms of having more protein and fats and fiber within that, but can still be a factor if it's something that's maybe on the extreme end. And there is potentially the flip side of that as well, where if you're someone who has very high energy output in terms of your weekly training load, weekly activity levels, etc., it could be the case that for some people, just not eating enough in the day leading up
to lunch and at lunch itself could mean that your energy levels are dipping because of that. So ensuring that your energy intake on an ongoing basis throughout the day is in a good place is probably going to help support you if you are finding yourself in that situation. Another factor to consider is the hydration side of things, because dehydration can have similar traits or similar feelings that could be described as this energy dip. Things like fatigue and low energy and even headaches. So if you're not drinking plenty of water throughout the day, not keeping up with the fluid demands that you're having, then it may be the case that you are feeling these signs of dehydration at that time of the day and therefore feeling that sort of energy slump. I would also consider things like your sleep and your caffeine intake and how you're timing that, because it could be the case simply that you're not getting enough sleep. And if you're drinking coffee earlier in the day, say one at the morning time, one at break time, and maybe even one at some other time before lunch, it may just be the case that the caffeine is masking your tiredness and your lack of sleep up until that point, but it gets to a point then where it can no longer do so, and then that's when you might feel the energy slump, or rather just feel probably the true lack of sleep that you have already had all that day, but have been almost masking it with the caffeine that you've been taking in. So obviously in that case, focusing on getting enough sleep in and considering your caffeine intake and how you want to approach that could be a good idea as well. Another thing that I would say anecdotally as well is that I found for myself, if I'm able to get some small amount of activity in immediately after eating lunch, even if it's a 5 to 10 minute walk or a stretch, that can help with reducing that energy slump that some people find in the afternoon. And I have my own theories around that, around why that might be, in terms of it putting a stimulus on the body to start disposing the glucose more quickly to the glycogen stores. But again, it's something worth trying, and if you experience improvements in that post-lunch energy slump for yourself as a result of that, then it's only going to be a good thing. Thanks for listening. If you'd like more free resources or info about my performance nutrition coaching program, hit the link in the podcast description.